Okay, folks, welcome back in to a new episode of Flourish FM. We have a special episode for you today. We recently had an old colleague of mine, Will Reusch, reach out with a question about some of the differences between happiness or well-being and meaning. And this came up because he was having a conversation as a school teacher with some of his young people around this notion of the pursuit of happiness. So Will and I connected, said, hey, let's all have a conversation. John and I would love to speak to this a little bit. And so it's going to be posted here on Flourish FM, but also on Will's podcast, Cylinder Radio. Had a great time, fascinating conversation. Johnny, what were some of the things that you really enjoyed about it?
Well, it was really fun just to have a kind of a three-way conversation where it wasn't so much me and you interviewing someone, but just a kind of equal conversation and us getting to then discuss various ideas we have and views we have on flourishing by reference to the research, outlining two particular frameworks, positive psychology and the human flourishing program at Harvard's framework, and then digging in deep to some particular areas. I particularly enjoyed the conversations we had about what happiness is, different theories of happiness, and then what its role in education might be in relation to how we define it, and whether an evil person can flourish or whether an evil person can even live a meaningful life and what the connection might be between them. That was pretty fun. How about you? What did you most enjoy?
Yeah, totally agree with both of those. I love getting into sort of those paradoxical questions. And the only sort of one I would add to it is coming back to Anna Lemke's work and some of the stuff we talked about with Todd Cash in episode 1 on sort of the presence of unpleasantness and its impact on well-being. So yeah. I think it still is going to be a lot of tangible takeaways for our listeners. I know Will really enjoyed it. We really enjoyed chatting with him. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Will Reusch.
What's happening, Will? How you doing, man?
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you again. How you been?
I'm good. Been good.
Good.
I start on Thursday back in the classroom, so.
Nice. Well, I thought maybe we'd start out, first of all, John, Will, John.
Hey, Will.
Yeah, hi, nice to meet you.
So, Will, just for a little bit of context, too, because we haven't caught up. I mean, when we had that initial conversation, it was like, I think the title was Positive Psychology in the COVID-19 era, something like that. I mean, it was right at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I think you and I were home from school. Just, teaching remotely, all those sorts of things. But John and I have really kind of tried to round out a focus more on human flourishing more holistically.
Cool.
So that's involved working with a lot of different entities, a lot of different researchers, and that's where the podcast has come in, right? So we're all educators, but when I saw your particular post about the distinctions between happiness and meaning and purpose and things of that nature, I thought, well, this is right in John's wheelhouse. I love what you're doing. It's been fun for me, knowing what you were doing before the pandemic, to see the way you've sort of opened up and expanded yourself and really dealing with some of these critical issues. And I don't know if you remember, but I taught a sociology class for a decade at Milken called Race, Class, and Gender. So a lot of the topics you're getting into hit home for me. And anyway, just really enjoying it. And I'm glad we can have this conversation.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me, man.
Sure.
I would say just the biggest thing is I teach a civics class. And I don't know if you remember, Nick, but John, I teach a civics class and bring philosophy into it. And I start with early, evolution and stuff like that to understand where we came from, then, where should we go type of stuff. And I play them some Kid Cudi, Pursuit of Happiness. And I talk about, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is in our Declaration of Independence and stuff. And it's like, is happiness the thing you should be aiming for? Because that's something that's told to these young people. It's told to them on TikTok. It's told to them all through social media is do what makes you feel good. And I have all these memes up. Do what makes you feel good. And I say let's break that down a little bit. And I guess what I'm concerned about, curious, I'm going to just to pick your brains and let you guys run with this idea is I'm worried that when you do that, you can find happiness by just hacking your happy chemicals, your dopamine and whatnot, in your brain. You just take a pill and you're happy. You could live a hedonistic lifestyle and you're happy. You could just have sex with, someone and it could destroy your whole life. You're married with kids or whatever, but you're pursuing that momentary happiness. Is that going to be something that's good for you? Is that a message that we should be giving kids? Because I remember hearing that as a kid, what's the point of life? The meaning of life is, or the point of life is just to be happy and find happiness. And it's no, I don't know if that's happiness. I feel like people aiming for happiness are going to spiral off into something really negative, and perhaps it is more meaning, aligned with Nietzsche, or even Viktor Frankl, talks about that a lot, searching for meaning and having meaning and things like that. So just what kind of message are we going to give to young people when they're bombarded with this? Do what makes you feel good stuff. Watch TikTok. It's a lot of that stuff, and then it leads to, pornography addiction that I think a lot of young men have, and all of that kind of stuff. So just curious. I just would love to have a conversation about what you guys think and how we can flush this out better.
For sure.
It's a great question. I mean, John, obviously jump in here. My immediate thoughts are we might kind of divide this into three buckets that come to mind, which is the psychology of happiness, the neuroscience of happiness, and also the philosophy of happiness. Because my immediate response is, well, it depends on what you mean by happiness, right? And we can break that down into, as scientists do and researchers do, into probably way too many different concepts and constructs. But I think it's useful for this conversation. So if it sounds good to you both, maybe we just kind of like tease apart each of those buckets a little bit first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's start. I mean, you mentioned a key word to me, which is hedonism, right? So hedonism in the science and the literature is one type of happiness. So when you say, let's pursue happiness, the pursuit of happiness is a core value, hedonism might be one form of that. What is hedonism? Simplistically, it's really just a balance of pleasant and unpleasant affect, right? So some of your examples in any given moment, you might have more pleasantness than unpleasantness. And in that moment, you might be hedonistically happy, right? There's other forms like subjective well-being, which are a combination of hedonism and life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is going to be a little bit more stable, right? So in your classroom, a kid fails your civics test, they might be hedonistically unhappy in that moment. Does that change their subjective well-being because it manipulates their life satisfaction? I'm not so sure. If it keeps them out of the college they want to go to, maybe. If it's just a blip on the radar, maybe not. That's very different than what I studied for my dissertation, which is eudaimonia or eudaimonia, depending on who you want to pronounce it for you, which is more of a meaning-based happiness, right? It's virtue cultivation. It's purpose-driven. It's about impact and contribution to the greater good. There are some scholars that argue hedonism and eudaimonia are not distinct, that they're the same. There's plenty of scholars that argue the opposite. They are distinct. And I would be one of those. I think that they are quite distinct. All of that's different than life satisfaction. And then all of that's different than human flourishing, which we can come back to in a little bit. But that's sort of the psychological premise. Like, what do we mean by happiness? And then how do we pursue it? I want to pause here, give John a chance to either add to that or speak to it from the philosophical lens. But we should also come back to the neuroscience piece, right? Because you brought up some really interesting tensions that we explored on our podcast with Dr. Anna Lemke, who's an addiction specialist at Stanford. I think it'd make a lot of sense to speak to some of those dynamics as well. But John, you want to jump in here first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, yeah, kind of I guess the logical place to start is with trying to clarify what exactly we mean by happiness here. And I guess one important point to make is that on some definitions of happiness, paradoxically, it involves some degree of unhappiness. So we recently interviewed Arthur Brooks for our podcast, kind of one of the world's leading happiness experts. And he has this tripartite definition of happiness. And one of the parts of it is that long-term happiness, and really that's how he defines happiness in the long term, your life as a whole, rather than some immediate sense of gratification for a day or even a week, something that's going to last, such that you feel a sense of life satisfaction or gain a sense of life satisfaction and fulfillment from it, would involve some degree of suffering towards, for example, some life purpose or some long-term goal. And so paradoxically, happiness can involve some degree of unhappiness in the short term because suffering is never pleasant. But the long-term benefits of some degree of suffering, which may come as a result of striving, will, yield some longer-term emotions such as happiness. So there can be some negative emotion in the short term on the pursuit towards longer-term life satisfaction. He defines happiness as this is one of the parts of it. So when we start to define happiness, perhaps in that kind of way, encouraging that to be one of or even perhaps the aim of education, or the well-being aim of education for students, starts to look a little less controversial, because we're not worried about students feeling really happy every day all the time. Yeah. It's like, no, you could spend years striving towards this long-term goal, which is doing the best you can at school, or really trying to find your sense of meaning that's going to then shape the rest of your life. And that involves a great deal of struggle and striving. But that's because your aim is, one of your aims, or perhaps your aim is happiness overall. So yeah, how controversial it looks to say the aim, or one of the aims of education is happiness, as Nick rightly points out, depends on how we define it. And some definitions will look more controversial than others. The hedonistic definition will look more controversial than others.
Yeah. I think for young people, because I was saying I play that Kid Cudi song and I put the lyrics up. And it's like, whatever, crush it a bit, blah, blah, blah. It's like about doing drugs. And it's like driving drunk, just doing my thing. And it's like, yeah, it's just like, let's go. Like that. So I think a lot of, I don't know how many teenagers, how many 17-year-olds are breaking it down, even like we just did, just in 5 minutes. I'm like, yeah, what is happy? I think they connect it to that, whatever, dump of happy chemicals. And it's like, well, driving drunk until you run a red light and you kill a woman and her 2 kids in the car, like there are negative repercussions to your actions. And I think that's just like I think that's just, even just flushing it out of like the different kinds of happiness. And even asking a teenager, ask a 16-year-old, like, what do you mean by happy? Like, even just that's a pretty basic question, but you can see like how complex it is. I mean, this is something that you studied for years and years and years at a top university level. It's not simple. So I think just like any kind of flushing things out to get more nuance is always seems like the goal. That's what I'm always interested in and promoting.
Yeah. And to John's point, right, some of this. So first of all, let's be clear about a couple things. There is an argument to be made for the presence of pleasantness, right? Like that, there's all sorts of good research on how that opens us up. There's a great theory in pos psych, the broaden and build theory from Barbara Fredrickson, that talks about how that opens us up to different experiences. We know from research on the Big 5 personality tests that openness to experience is correlated with all sorts of positive life outcomes, right? We know that when we feel loved, we're more likely to give love in return, for instance, right? So there's plenty to be said for the presence of pleasantness. There's also plenty to be said for the presence of unpleasantness. And here's where we can kind of come back to the neuroscience. So in our conversation with Anna Lemke, and again, I mentioned she's the addiction specialist at Stanford, she's got a wonderful book called Dopamine Nation. And anyone listening, I highly, highly, highly recommend you check it out. The basic idea is this: the constant and perpetual pursuit of what we might loosely call happiness, which would be that dopamine drive. Check the notification, check the email, play the video game, watch the pornography, whatever it might be, paradoxically can lead to anhedonia, right? Which is the complete opposite of what we mentioned earlier, hedonism, right? Mm-hmm. It actually locks you out of the ability to experience pleasure. You raise your baseline so high, right, that you actually become incapable of experiencing pleasure as a result. What she suggests instead is that we need to find balance between the two. Doing hard stuff, and there's a great book by this title now, Steve Magnus, I think, right? Do Hard Things. Doing hard stuff over the long term, to John's point, sometimes even the short term, right? Submerging yourself in a cold tub, for instance, can release some of that same dopamine, but in a healthier way, right? What goes up must come down, but conversely, what goes down must come up. And so she describes it as this teeter-totter, right? There are times to say yes, there are times to say no. And we see this in the psychological world as well. A lot of your listeners might be familiar with the marshmallow study or the marshmallow test. Yeah. Cute little kids come in, right? And the basic idea here is that they have to delay gratification by waiting to eat the marshmallow in front of them in hopes that they'll get a second one, right? And the studies show that over the course of years, the kids who can wait for the second marshmallow and delay gratification, they do better on a whole host of outcomes. Okay, so yes, and do you spend your entire life waiting for the marshmallow? Sometimes you got to eat the fucking thing, right? Yeah. So there's this teeter-totter piece again, right? In terms of not only the neurochemistry, but the psychology as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard the marshmallow thing too. Is like, what is it? There's always all the different ways you can skew it too. Like if you wait like so long, then you get 10 marshmallows. And they wait, like how much of a time frame? It's really interesting, like just breaking that down. I know there are probably some flaws to that study about where they did it and things like that. But that's just any social science study is going to have flaws, right? Because people are just complex. I saw Naval Ravikant say something along the lines of like, the social sciences aren't sciences. It's like, well, if it follows the scientific method, it is by definition, right? I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
So my PhD professor often would call it a soft science, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to get the same levels of replicability, right, that you might in some of the quote unquote hard science, physics, for instance, but you still can elicit patterns and trends, and to a certain extent, generalizations. But he also said, and you just hit the nail on the head, there is no such thing as a perfect study. So there's always going to be some caveats.
Yeah. Just because of human differences and things like that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, to bring this also into human flourishing, so delayed gratification. Yeah. So the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, one of our podcast sponsors, they have a flourishing measure that they've designed with 6 domains. And one of them is character and virtue. And they have 2 items in that questions they ask. And one of them is based on delayed gratification. The question is, the statement in the item is, I'm always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And you rank from 0 being not true of me to 10 completely true of me. And that's the reason for including that is based on rigorous research on well-being research over longitudinal studies on what suggests certain good character traits to have or character virtues to have that would suggest they highly enhance your well-being over time.
Yeah.
It's worth getting, I think, since John brought it up, into some of these various components of flourishing. There's really kind of 2 predominant models out there, and maybe I'll walk us through one of them, the PERMA model.
Yeah, I mean, how do they design it? Like, or how do they measure that? Is really a question. I'll also define it. Yeah, like how do you define, are you flourishing or not? It's kind of like asking people, are you happy? Are you fulfilled? It's like compared to what? Like compared to me a couple of years ago, but compared to where I could be, maybe not. This is, I'm so interested because you guys are deep in this world of like measuring these things, I guess, that are seemingly immeasurable. That makes sense. Well, didn't Einstein have something like that above his office in Princeton? Like not everything that counts can be counted or something like that. And I guess you guys are in like the world of trying to count that stuff.
We're trying.
Yeah. So, it's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I'll walk us through PERMA. John, you walk us through the Harvard model a little bit, but you also just hit the nail on the head there, Will. It depends on time point, right? It depends on length of time, but it's also worth mentioning it very much depends on culture. So we're going to lay out some components that, in fairness, have come from a lot of studies that I think prototypically are done on weird populations. You know, this acronym WEIRD, Western, educated, intellectual, rich, developed nations, right? So, you and I are both married to Asian women, for instance, like that orientation towards meaning versus happiness is very different. I don't know about for you, but for my in-laws, you're going to see a different sort of orientation and conceptualization, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Trying to hold all of that constant, though, or at least set it to the side for the moment. 2 primary models of human flourishing out there. I'll walk you through UPenn's model, and John can walk you through Harvard's model. So UPenn, the acronym is PERMA, PERMA, and then you will often see adaptations that add a V or an H at the end. So PERMA V or PERMA H. P for pleasant emotion. There's your hedonia. That matters. Okay. E for engagement. There's your eudaimonia. So to John's point, character and virtue, but also flow. If you're familiar with the flow state, John and I do a lot of coaching for Flow Research Collective around this state. This is deeply immersive experiences that are autotelic and rewarding. So hobbies, passionate pursuits, things of that nature. R for relationships, right? And different types of relationships. So intimacy, friendship, family, community. Single greatest predictor of happiness worldwide, right? The quality of our relationships. Second greatest predictor worldwide is the M, meaning. a connection to something greater than oneself. The A is achievement. And this is not traditional achievement like you might think of as awards and accolades and income and all those sorts of things, but developing competency, mastering one's environment, having a sense of self-efficacy and self-esteem and confidence, right? And then the V or the H that you'll often see is health or vitality. So the core physiological pieces, sleep, nutrition, hydration, movement, breath, things of that nature. So coming back to the point you made earlier, a lot of it is about the synergy between these components, right? If you are in love with somebody or married to somebody and your hedonistic tendencies lead you to cheat, well, you might get P, pleasant emotion, during that instance, but you're probably going to ruin an R, right? And you might sacrifice some of your sense of character as well. So we're really trying to help people, I think, understand all of these components and think about how they build a synergistic life that really addresses any or all of them. That doesn't mean they all need to be 10 out of 10s all the time, right? But bringing those ingredients together to kind of cook, if you will, the recipe that's going to lead to a fulfilling life.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially because balance is something that I'm just, obviously comes up all the time, is like need some sort of balance. And that idea of different buckets to try and balance it out. So one's not, because if one goes up too much, it might be at the expense of the other. Do you generally measure this through like questionnaires?
Yeah.
Because I had this like top chimp expert named Franz de Waal on my podcast. It was really fun to talk to him.
I know Franz de Waal. I mean, I don't know him personally, but he did the macaque monkey grape throwing.
The grapes and stuff. Yes. He also coined the term alpha male about like who, how does like a chimp troop like choose who's in charge and stuff. Interesting stuff. But but he said the cool thing about chimps is like whatever, they're 97% human, and you can learn about humans from watching them, because a lot of humans, he gave an example, like if you ask a human a questionnaire, how often do you have sex? Like they will write it, but it's their interpretation of it. Even if they're not just like bragging like a frat kid or something like that, they might interpret something that didn't actually happen, because we do that all the time. Where a chimp, you can just watch them do it. Like you can't, in psychological studies, you can't just like watch people all the time, because then they know there's cameras around. And then if you did it when they didn't know, then it would be immoral and unethical. So it's really tricky, because people's perception of like, how are your relationships? If you are a very ignorant person, you have no self-awareness. I was just in a conversation with someone in my family just the other day, and I asked them like a very basic question, because they said something like, just being around you triggers me. I go, why? This is someone I'm very close to. And they go, I don't know. Like there's just no awareness about like basic things in their life. So aren't they going to answer those questions? Like they might say, so you said like hydration level. So they might say how much you drink. They say a lot. And then you can do a hydration test in a hard science kind of version and so show actually you don't drink much at all. So how do you deal with that, guys? Like that's a tricky thing for me when we're doing these social science things.
100%. John, obviously jump in here at any time. What you're talking about is often referred to as a self-report measure, which a lot of these studies are based on, and 100% they have problems with them. And some of the biases involved are the most obvious problems, right? Or an ignorance or a naivete.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we know pretty empirically that our subjective experience can actually shift our physiology as well. So you can also say, all right, well, how reliable is a self-report measure if these biases can get in? And at the same time, I would just play devil's advocate and push back and say, if somebody subjectively says that they are happy or fulfilled, right, or experiencing meaning, do we care?
Perception is reality. And I mean, to some degree, even maybe ignorance is bliss. Like that could be, right?
100%. I'd be curious if that's part of what triggers that family member of yours, because you are on some level are probably shattering some bubbles for them.
Yeah, that's what we eventually got to. But
interesting.
But that's I guess so. It's John. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, perception's reality, but also interpretation is reality. And the job of a good researcher is to ensure that research is interpreted in responsible and sufficient and correct ways, as well as disseminating that research. So when you do a social science study or a self-report study, gather quantitative or qualitative research to ensure that you're stating an adequate number of caveats and ensure that people are clear on what they are in terms of how the data is interpreted, and that the data gathering is from a diverse and large source. And if it isn't, to state that, in the dissemination of the research. And that is what the researchers have, depending on your position, but researchers have a serious responsibility when it comes to disseminating knowledge, because many people will trust the claims of researchers, and often with excellent reason, right? It's published in a respectable peer-reviewed journal. Why shouldn't they? And if the researcher has good stature, but that does place a lot of responsibility on a researcher to ensure that what they communicate is communicated both clearly and also with sufficient warnings. Okay, don't think that this is, the end story of what happiness is, or that if you do this, you'll become more happy, or if you do this, you'll become more lonely or less happy, for example. And I've certainly experienced that in educational research since working in education research the last 7.5 years, that teachers and school leaders are extremely busy and will often not have the time to dig deeper into research articles or research claims that are made. And if you go and give a talk at a school, or if you publish a research article in education, that'll often be shared around. It'll often gain a lot of influence in education, but that requires a lot of responsibility. So an example of this will be Carol Dweck's work on mindset. Now, she's done a great job, I think, of disseminating that very responsibly, but it's been further disseminated down the line by others who haven't disseminated it so responsibly. And sometimes it becomes a satire of what it really is.
Yeah.
People just, talk about the power of yet on something and think that, if we just train students to add the word yet to the end of sentences, that's going to cultivate a growth mindset and give them all these new powers to help them, fulfill their potential. So I can't do this. No, I can't do this yet. Right. You got it. Let's go. We got that. That's like one tiny bit of a complex system that you need to try to, integrate throughout an education institution for it to really work. And so, the point I'm making here is really that interpretation of research is vital, but that requires researchers and those further disseminating it to do an important job, a responsible job of carefully getting it out there. Using it well.
And context is critical too. We already gave one example, like cultural context, but John's point is well made, right? Carol's research is really about incremental theory of intelligence and entity theory of intelligence. It's not just growth or fixed mindset applied to everything everywhere, right? John's sitting in London right now. If I wanted to go share a pint with him, should I have a growth mindset or fixed mindset about my ability to swim there to do that?
Right.
I should have a fixed mindset, right? Like the power of yet will do nothing for me there, right? So context is really important here as well.
Yeah.
I love Carol Dweck stuff. I think people latch on to like the same way that people read the headline and not the article. I just want to pull out the basic stuff. So like stuff like with my children, I have 5 and 7 and a baby. Let's say stuff like instead of saying you're really smart, like leaning into you're a hard worker or things like that. Like I try to do those. You're making bad decisions. You're not a bad person. You're making bad decisions, to give them more of that kind of thinking. But yeah, it's a complex thing. I love that concept of depending on what it is, like what you said about swimming over there. I've also heard something similar. I think it's similar, which is like limitations actually give you more freedom. So if I have a kid who's 5'2" and 90 pounds soaking wet, to say like, what do you want to be when you grow up? You're not going to be an NFL lineman is actually more freeing for him, because then he can look at all the different things that are real. Like to say like to a fish, you're limited to water places, you can't go anywhere, is actually more freeing, because they're not gonna waste time trying to crawl on land or something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Certain limitations can be emancipatory.
And I like giving that to young people, because when they're told you can do anything, you can be anything, that leads to a lot of kids, especially at the school I'm at now, which is like a private school. Kids, are told that you can be anything. It leads to a lot of anxiety because like you're at this point, you're 18 years old or whatever. You have literally infinity paths in front of you, which you're being told I can take any path. That is overwhelming for someone who doesn't even know who they are yet. And to say like, well, you can't do anything. You can do these things though, is maybe a little bit more freeing and a little bit less anxiety inducing.
Yeah.
100%. 100%.
Yes. So we've got a lot of different conversation points here. I just want to go back through a couple of them in reverse chronological order. So just to respond to your point a bit more directly, Will, on the dangers of self-report from well-being.
Yes.
My argument would be in response to that's not a reason not to do them, but it's a reason to try to do them as well as possible and remind people. And this is why I made the point about interpreting research, to make it very clear that this tells you these things, and these are the potential biases that are creeping in, and we should be very much aware of those, as you both stated, some examples of those. And that isn't a reason to not do them. It's a reason to do them and interpret them adequately, and then try to put that into a holistic picture of what can we learn from this. And I think often people kind of take this jump of saying, well, these are self-report and there's these biases, therefore just ignore all that stuff. It's rubbish. Yeah. And I think that's a big jump, because we can learn a lot. If you do a survey of 10,000 people in rigorous studies, you can learn things from this. You can gain valuable knowledge. We have gained valuable knowledge from these kinds of things, but we shouldn't conclude that, well, I'll become more happy if I just follow the routes from all these things. And one important reason for that is, so I loved the first episode Nick and I released on our podcast with Todd Cashton, who's an individual differences researcher at his core. And this theme has come up a number of time in conversations, the importance of paying attention to individual differences between people. And that is a huge issue in research and human flourishing and well-being, because the differences amongst people are so massive that
what if he studies a lot of identical twins?
Yeah, so that's what often studies are on identical twins, because they gather some data about, if you have different stimuli, different environments, how does that change the course of one of their lives? But attention to individual differences is vital in well-being research, because we shouldn't be extrapolating this to our lives immediately. We should be trying to know, okay, well, I can apply maybe some things here based on my course in life, my self-understanding and so on, but not the whole package.
Yeah, I love that, because I think that people are going to a binary of what you're saying is essentially like gospel. This study, look at this study. This study is going to guide everything, or this study is nonsense. And it is somewhere in the middle. You can do as well as you can. I think there has to be a lot of openness. Stuff like this, the studies of like, the Kinsey studies of like sex and stuff like that were obviously done by, there were the people that were being studied were like inmates that were, a lot of them were like sexual abusers and predators and stuff like that. So that's an excuse. So we have to have openness about that. I had Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay in my podcast who did those hoax studies. Did you guys see those hoax papers?
Yeah, I know about those. Yeah.
That was really wild. And I see it a lot of these people who are in these, they're in biology, they're a biology, PhD or something like that, but they're in it to be an activist, to just have those, the alphabet after their name so that they can go out and push their activism. But it's not good science. So I think almost having like in social media, they call it like open source coding. Like, how was this study done? So the commoners, I'm not a researcher, like the commoners can understand, how did you get this information? It's all open. So where the flaws might be, where the positives are, where the biases come in, all stuff like that. Is that done a lot in the research that you guys have seen and done? Is it like open source so we know how the studies are all taking place, so we can
probably not enough? And this is a whole another conversation and tangent. I think a lot of academics would argue that the academic world has the same level of kind of, in some cases, corruption and issues that any other part, of life might have. And so that might come down to the peer review process. It might come down to the journal. It might come down to the researcher who funded it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different things that can kind of play a role in this. There's really, really famous psychological concepts that are being seriously called into question. You probably know, like the Stanford prison experiment and Philip Zimbardo and some of those things. So certainly, I don't think there's any particular, it goes back to the original point we made about, academic research. There's no study that's impervious to criticism. And I don't think there's any piece of research that applies to everybody, everywhere, all the time.
Well, two things I want to say on this. First, sometimes that's the outcome. That doesn't mean that the research wasn't valuable, because we like to know, it's important to know the causes behind things and the reasons why things happen and so on, and then we can understand them better. The second is that sometimes you get counterintuitive results on things. So while I try to think from well-being research, I'll just give an example from the science of learning. I've worked a lot on the science of learning, and there you get you get research showing things like the best kind of learning is effortful learning. So teachers, educators, more generally lecturers, spend a huge amount of time trying to make teaching resources clear as possible and help students understand as quickly as possible. And the mark of a successful lesson or class is the students left the room and they just got it. And it felt like it was just effortless learning this stuff. And their teacher was great because they just sailed through this stuff without any effort at all. But the evidence shows quite clearly that the more effortful the learning process is, the more gains you get long term, because the more you're having to think about something and retrieve learning, the more it gets embedded in your long-term memory.
More neuroplasticity, right? Think about what we mentioned earlier, that pleasure-pain paradox as well, like do hard things. We talked about the flow state. One of the initial stages of a flow state is really a stress state, right? It's responding to environmental cues and kind of saying, okay, I need to rise to the occasion and expand a little bit beyond whatever I was prior.
Yeah. So that then yields all kinds of, so for a start, that seems quite counterintuitive. You're really struggling to do something. You're like, look, I'm really not learning this very well. This shouldn't be so difficult. But often that's a sign that you're learning it better because you're really having to think about it more in a more hard way. But then that gives rise to all kinds of counterintuitive practical points about good education. For example, if you make this beautifully constructed handout for your class that the student looks at it, they're like, this is great. Okay, I don't need to write anything. I've got it. I've got my revision notes here. Well, that's terrible for their learning because they don't write anything on it. It'd be better to give them a blank piece of paper and talk, and they're writing things down, they're drawing it out in their own way, thinking about it, they're sketching their mind on the page in a certain way, and they're actively learning more from it. This was kind of for me a personal sort of revolution when I learned this stuff, and I was like, my teaching resources are rubbish. They look great, but students aren't having to do enough work. So you get counterintuitive, studies that try to show things like, well, if you make your PowerPoint slides a bit less clear, sometimes that can have learning benefits and so on. On this, I recommend a book called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. It came out in 2014, Harvard University Press. That goes through these kinds of claims. But that's just an example of where you don't get the research showing, oh yeah, we knew this all along. Quite the opposite. You're like, a counterintuitive claim actually has more support in favor of it. And in the case of well-being research, it might be something like, let's say people argued that accomplishment and achievements are really good for your well-being over time. Therefore, working a certain number of hours a week and not kind of sitting around doing nothing is really good for your well-being over time. And then a study came along and said, actually, well, no, spending quite a lot of time sitting doing nothing, inverted commas, if that means mindfulness practice, if that means a break away from what you're doing, is better for your well-being over time. And spending less time working and more time cultivating relationships about your well-being, that would go against a purportedly intuitive claim, but that relies on that assumption being true that accomplishment is good long-term. That's just one possible example.
That's actually a great, I think, connection back to the other primary sort of conceptualization of human flourishing. And John, maybe you'd walk, Will, through this a little bit, the Harvard measure, because there's a really, really key difference, a couple differences, but a really important one that distinguishes the Harvard measure from PERMA, UPenn's measure, and it's actually the absence of achievement or accomplishment as one of the domains. So yeah, John just put it in the link, but John, would you walk us through the 6 domains a bit?
Yeah, sure. So this is a more recent measure than positive psychology. Positive psychology is sort of early 20th century. This was, being put forward, the PERMA model, as Nick explained. The Human Flourishing Program, the kind of the main article, the seminal article by Tyler van der Wiel, the director of the Human Flourishing Program, was published in 2017. And they put forward an account of flourishing that has 5 domains to it, like PERMA. It actually has a 6th domain, I'll describe in a moment. And those 5 domains are happiness and life satisfaction first, 2nd, mental and physical health, 3rd, meaning and purpose, 4th, character and virtue, and 5th, close social relationships. And they argue that flourishing isn't reducible to these, but these are kind of at least part of what we mean by flourishing and ought to be features of any plausible account. They also then define flourishing more broadly than positive psychology. In positive psychology, at least with the PERMA model, it would be psychological well-being. The Human Flourishing Program defined it as complete human well-being, a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, and sometimes as societal good, broadly construed. And they draw upon the empirical evidence behind positive psychology, but also literature covering public health studies, empirical studies that show substantial contributors to well-being to try and offer this broader study. They had a 6th domain, financial and material stability. The argument for that being that to flourish long-term, so for longer than a month, for example, you need sufficient financial and material resources.
Yeah.
But they put that as a 6th because the 5 key domains are ones that they argue you pursue as ends in themselves. If you like, Nick mentioned this word autotelic earlier. Autotelic, auto meaning self and telos meaning goal, a thing you do as an end in itself. And positive psychology argues that those 5 domains in PERMA also you pursue as ends in themselves. They argue these 5 domains you pursue as ends in themselves, but the 6th, financial material stability, you don't pursue as an end in itself, or people don't tend to at least, rather they pursue it to support those other ends. But nonetheless, you've got to have it to flourish for more than a week, a day, or a month.
Depending on where you are, of course, because Will, your initial post that I think led to this conversation brings us back to the 2nd episode of our podcast, Flourish FM, with Emily Esfahani Smith. She's got a terrific book called The Power of Meaning, and she's got a TED Talk that's been viewed, I don't even remember, John, millions and millions and millions of times, right?
9 million times, I think.
There you go. And in the opening chapters, I think actually in the introduction of the book, one of the things she does is lay out all the statistics about life satisfaction, fulfillment globally. And the fact of the matter is, some of the materialistically poorest nations in the world also will have some of the highest scores in terms of satisfaction and fulfillment, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a genius to look at the Western world, and in particular the US where we're sitting, with tons and tons and tons of material wealth and access to all sorts of things, but skyrocketing ill-being numbers and mental illness numbers and things of that nature. So there's interesting interplay and dynamics here, but certainly the core tenet here is it's going to generally be a little harder to flourish if you are worried about food, water, shelter, right? Core basic.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that old Princeton study about like, can money buy happiness? They landed on like $75,000, which again changes. I remember that like years and years ago. And it was basically saying that you can get things like you get a vacation. If your refrigerator breaks, you can get a new one. Like you have like heat. Like you get the basics. And the way I explain it is like, I have an old Corvette. It's not worth anything. It's worth like $9,000, but it's loud and it's fast and it's fun. And the difference between, I'm like a car guy. I love working on cars. So the difference between not having a car and having my, $9,000 Corvette is a bigger jump in like satisfaction than going from my Corvette to a brand new Lamborghini. Like it's like the difference once you get above 75,000 that they found was like, it's actually not that big. It's like going to vacation. I'm in LA. So like going to Santa Barbara with my family versus not having a vacation is bigger than going to like Bora Bora or something, like just getting those things. Would that seem like it rings true for you guys?
That study was excellent reasons were given for calling it into question around April 2021. There's an article published in The Economist on that. I haven't dug deep into that research yet, actually. I want to.
I have a little bit.
Again, that goes in my gut, though. That makes sense. It makes sense that if you are happier. Well, I had a car that didn't have air conditioning for a while, and I go up and down the hill to the valley, and in September, it's 105 degrees, and I don't have air conditioning. I was less satisfied with my life. Once I got air conditioning, even though I was still in a crappy car, but I had air conditioning, that made a difference. It makes sense that if you have those basics, like you were saying, Nick, and maybe 75 grand for like a family of 4 was just like the number they had at the time. I'm curious what was off about that. Because again, this goes with like my gut goes, that makes sense, but it doesn't mean that it's true. My gut can be steering me wrong all the time.
Well, so some of the pieces here, and it actually ties together a lot of these threads, because like John said, about a year ago, another study came out also out of UPenn, although not the Pause Psych Center, that called this study or these series of studies into question. What do you define as happiness, right? His data showed that happiness is not going to move, but life satisfaction will, and he couldn't find an upper limit to that trend, right? So we're talking about like kind of flatlining and diminishing returns. He was pushing back against that. Now, I haven't looked in the last, I don't know, probably 8 months or so, but he was called into question because he wouldn't share the data, right? So this is flying in the
open
face
source, right?
Open source, right? So you've got this debate back and forth. And what do you mean by the metrics? What's your sample? Who are you looking at? Right. And then there's a hugely important key variable here, which is what do you use the money for? There's a lot of good research on materialistic values being correlated with ill-being, for instance, right? There's a lot of other good research on spending money on experiences and people and impact and things of that nature, and having a much more pronounced positive effect on well-being levels. So there's a ton of nuance to this argument.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, what are you spending? If you start a nonprofit and you give, like good prosthetic limbs to kids who, don't have legs, like you probably get more satisfaction than if you buy a gold-plated Rolls Royce and roll up and down Sunset Boulevard with it. The health thing you mentioned, John, is also a big one that I didn't hear that. Is that in the PERMA? Is that part of the PERMA one?
So yeah, I'm glad you asked this. So let's tease out it's important to tease out some differences here between positive psychology's account of flourishing and the human flourishing programs. So one thing that Tyler van der Wiel argues are absent in positive psychology and other measures of psychological well-being are health, character, and virtue. Now, Nick mentioned the PERMA model. There are also developments of the PERMA model that add bits, add other letters to it. So you get like PERMA H, which I believe Geelong Grammar School in Australia kind of supplemented their account of PERMA to add H at the end for health because it didn't have it. And you get PERMA V, which is vitality, which is kind of how able you feel.
That's right. Okay,
that energy. So someone who's really hungover has very low vitality. And someone who feels full of energy when they wake up in the morning has high vitality. But in the PERMA model, at least, it does pay attention to character, I think, with character strengths, for example. But there are many objections of being leveled against positive psychology. Doesn't pay enough attention to virtue, to being a morally good person, and that its emphasis is quite on the individual rather than groups of people. And that physical health isn't really attended to as much as psychological health. I mean, it accounts for flourishing in terms of psychological well-being in the PERMA model, right? So that seems fair. The Human Flourish Program argue that you should include health, mental and physical, in account of flourishing, even if you just define flourishing as well-being, and that character and virtue should be included, because these are often ends themselves rather than things that pursue for other ends. But also, I mean, surely to flourish, you have to be living a decent, maybe not a fully virtuous life, but at least not a morally bad life, right? So you need to say something about being a good person in there. And going right back to Aristotle and eudaimonia, it's really about being a good person, living a virtuous life. Not that was necessarily the correct kind of flourishing, but that's where research in the West on flourishing really begins, and the notion of flourishing gains itself as a concept in the West. So it seems that it's quite weird to not talk about being virtuous or being a good person in account of flourishing. So there's some different.
Well, so I would argue, John, that PERMA does, right? Character strengths fall under 6 sets of virtues, right? There are 6 umbrella sets that these 24 character strengths fall under. But John still raises a really interesting philosophical question as well, which we talked to one of our guests about.
I think that's the problem with a lot of the people who would be categorized as like woke or whatever, is like, I'm such a good person because I changed my Instagram thing or whatever it is. That's a tricky one if you're asking people, because it's all their perception. People who have a inflated sense of self-satisfaction are going to say that they're really virtuous. How do you guys get around that?
John, I'd like to hear from the philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, do they apply? Like, like, Kant's categorical imperative? Like, do they think about that? I don't think many of them do. I don't know how many philosophy majors end up getting into like thinking like that, but maybe they do. I don't know.
So what kind of decision process are we thinking of here? And who is the they just applying to people in general? How many people?
People in general. If you say like, how virtuous are you? How virtuous of a life? Like a lot of that could be if you're surrounded by, cult leaders would say that they're very virtuous. Right. Some of the worst people in history. That's why you brought up Hitler. I would say would say he is very virtuous. So Stalin would probably believe that he did.
Yeah.
What do we do with that?
Yeah, I mean, there is this philosophical problem goes way back called the guise of the good, which is roughly the idea of human, and really a point about moral psychology, that human beings often believe they're aiming to the argument behind one position here is that human beings often aim towards what they believe, or perhaps even always aim towards what they believe is good, but often fall massively short of it. And and if they have a completely distorted vision of what is good. So to go to the case of something like Hitler, for example, if we tried to apply that argument to Hitler, it would be the claim that Hitler believed what he was doing was best for the people of Germany at the time, to give them more Lebensraum, breathing space, and this would be best for Germany. But he was just a monster, so had a completely skewed vision of what was the right thing to do. But he believed this was the right thing to do, and so you get accounts of this going right back to Plato, the idea of evil being a privation, that the person aims at the good, but they fall so far short of the good that evil takes place as a privation of good rather than aiming at evil. And the debate here is whether a human being can rationally aim at what they know is the wrong thing to do. Because it's quite odd to think that, and the argument behind that is it's quite odd for to think that human beings just know this is terrible, but I'm going to do it anyway. But often they're like, no, this is justifiable. I'm going to do this, but just a terrible way of reasoning. There's a whole huge, long-standing philosophical debate around that. In the case of Hitler, if you tried to apply that argument there, it would be something like Hitler believed that what he was doing was right, but was a monster, was a psychopath, a sociopath.
How would he do filling out one of these questionnaires, though? How would he do on one of these questionnaires? He'd probably say, I'm flourishing. I mean, health-wise, even like, I love that saying that a sick person wants one thing, a healthy person wants 10,000 things. I think that's why I love the vitality, health, element of these. But when you're on meth, like at least when you're high, you're feeling great. I mean, he looked great. So he would fill out these studies and be like, wow, this guy is flourishing. No, am I? Would he not?
Well, yeah. Sorry, John.
Because I'm going to argue against the whole idea that Hitler could live a meaningful life. So,
well, so let's get into that though, because in our third episode, when we chatted with Scott Barry Kaufman, who's one of the world's most famous psychologists, he really kind of pushed back against this notion of flourishing as the aim, right? And that he pushes for self-actualization because of this element of transcendence, this element of going beyond oneself, being connected with this greater whole, this greater good. Even that, I think, is tricky and tense because, listen, I've lived on both coasts of the United States. I grew up, born and raised in the Midwest. I've been around the richest of the rich. I've spent a lot of time around the poorest of the poor. In my estimation, most people care about other people, right? They're not just entirely selfish and narcissistic. They have some sort of meaning. They have some sort of purpose. But we often differ on who we care about most and where we prioritize and direct some of those actions, which to me in part speaks to kind of some of the elements you bring up in your work, in your shows, and trying to bring people more to the middle. Hey, we've got a lot of shared values and virtues, but we're directing them to different populations and efforts. Yeah, John, jump back in.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go back full circle and argue that I need to give this argument some more thought, but I mean, there have been various talks I've been to where people have tried to argue things like Hannibal Lecter could flourish, a serial killer could flourish, and given then some account of flourishing that argues that could be the case. Especially
if it's a self-analysis, right? To some degree.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that I think it would show that there's a serious problem with our account of flourishing if it allows deeply evil people to flourish. Not just, no,
Great.
I don't say deeply evil, just evil people to flourish. And that's why it's so important to have character and virtue brought in there. And Nick's argument that positive psychology does attend to this vision is interesting. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. I think that's an important way to play off the debate between these different measures of flourishing, whether indeed that's fair to argue that positive psychology doesn't pay enough attention to it. Putting that aside for a moment, though, I think that to flourish, you need to be living at least a morally decent life, certainly not causing harm to others. You don't have to be, the Dalai Lama, but you need to be leading a morally respectful life, virtuous in at least a minimal sense. And that if you are living an evil life, to say that someone evil is living a meaningful life, I think is a problem for our account of meaning. And that we should look at that carefully and think, wait a minute, that we shouldn't be in a position where we're saying this person lived a really meaningful life who committed genocide or was a serial killer. No, that's a problem, and we need to revisit that. In the case of Emily's book, The Power of Meaning, Emily S. Smith, I don't think we get that account from that. We discussed that briefly, but I think in there, if we look at the pillars of meaning and what they involve, she has these 4 pillars of meaning. And that they're virtuous ways to spend your life, a sense of belonging with others and so on, telling a story about your life that constructs a good narrative of it. These involve attention to virtue and involve living a minimally virtuous life such that you couldn't really live a meaningful life. You couldn't live a meaningful life for Hitler. Hitler did not lead a meaningful life, I would argue.
Well, he might have been a psychopath, right? I mean, do psychopaths, and who do exist even in small numbers, do they throw a wrench into this? To some degree, right? Like into the studies because they have a mental disorder?
So that's a great question. And I think we need to bring up, and I'm not as familiar with this line of research, John, maybe you are, but Corey Keyes has a conceptualization and really these 4 quadrants and argues that you can have a mental illness and flourish. Right? That the 2 are not mutually exclusive, right? So that kind of throws a monkey wrench into things a little bit. Whether or not sociopath is the same thing as sort of these different types of mental illnesses is a whole nother nuanced debate. But I totally agree with John, and I bring it back to kind of the bridge between philosophy and psychology on some level. When I was teaching the sociology class in Los Angeles, we do a lot of Alistair McIntyre, right? So the veil of ignorance. So the basic premise behind the veil of ignorance is that if you dropped a veil of ignorance in front of somebody so they could not see how actions or policies were going to affect them, what would they choose to do, right? If you removed them from the equation and just said, what's fair, what's just, right? What's the right way to do something, not knowing how it's going to impact you, what would they choose, right? So then when you come back to something like virtue, so we're going back and forth between virtue and character in Harvard and engagement in PERMA, right? So the engagement breaks down into these character strengths. There's 24 of them that build up to these 6 virtues. Well, how did they arrive at this set of 24 character strengths? They brought together 50, 60 different researchers from around the world and kind of looked at different cultures, different governments, different ideologies, and basically said, like, what do most people agree on, right? What do most decent people agree is good to have as a human being? Gratitude, self-regulation, optimism, appreciation of beauty and excellence, all these sorts of things. And I think on some level, what these ideas speak to is, sure, you could have a sense of purpose in that you are doing something good for a community. So Hitler might have felt a great sense of purpose around what he was doing for Germans, right? But I think it also has to be accompanied by the absence of negatively impacting a broad swath of people too. And that's what his story obviously and significantly dramatically lacks, right? You and I are both longtime teachers in Jewish schools, so we're highly sensitive to this. To me, that brings back to McIntyre a little bit as well, right? If you put that veil of ignorance, what would you choose to do if you knew how it wasn't going to affect you? And I think if that asshole sitting right here today and said, like, hey, if you were on the receiving end of this, would you still call it meaning and purposeful? And would you still say it's a flourishing life? who the hell knows, because he was a sociopath, right? But I think most people would say, no, it does not. There has to be the building of something good for others, and ideally paired with the absence of something bad.
Yeah, and Nick's also drawn attention to a point that allows me to better develop something I was saying a moment ago about the reasons why Emily Esfahani-Smith's account wouldn't say that Hitler lived a meaningful life. I mentioned that she has these 4 pillars of meaning, things that make up meaning. You know, I mentioned storytelling, and the narrative you would tell of your life, you know, to some degree needs to map on with the truth, right? Now, Hitler says, hey, I've lived this really purposeful, meaningful life. Look at all the good I've done for the world. Look at how I've, you know, pushed forward the people who were living under my rule. It just would be completely false, right? It wouldn't have promoted meaning for others in any significant sense. It's just promoted suffering. So the storytelling side of it would be absent in meaning, as well as belonging. I mean, what kind of, you know, good, healthy relationships the totality wants to have with others and so on, right?
So it seems like a lot of this will just be more effective if people have a critical eye about themselves and a more accurate view of themselves and who they are. You know, it's shocking. I gave it just an anecdote earlier, but like, it's shocking how people are so unaware of who they are, the way they act in the world. And then young people, population that all of us have been dealing with, like, they don't know who the hell they are yet. They're trying to figure this out. I guess it would just be, a lot of this is like a reflective thing, and it goes back to the perception is reality stuff. But yeah, I guess there has to be some element, like you're saying, of storytelling where they go, you're acting this way, how does this affect others? And that will spark some empathy in other people. There has to be some element of that, because people are so isolated sometimes, especially after COVID. These kids were so isolated, and they were telling themselves these own narratives about who they were and what the world was, and they didn't have any kind of engagement with outside things that challenge that. People don't want to be challenged. If you think that you're a good person and someone says, hey, read this book. If you read this book, you're going to realize that you're a real asshole. Then they go, why would I read that book? I'm not going to do that then.
Yeah.
That's a really scary realization for people. And I get why they don't want to do it. But for us to try and solve this, you almost have to do that. You have to challenge your own ideas. But how do you get people?
Well, that brings us back to Todd as well. And a key term that he uses in the first book I ever read that brought me into sort of Todd's world and research that he wrote with Robert Biswas-Diener is called The Upside of Our Dark Side, right? And in it, he talks about a concept called distress tolerance, right? And it brings us back to Anna Lemke and do hard things. Like, you have to be willing to engage and endure and navigate some of that unpleasantness in order to grow in any way, shape, or form. It's also a theme in John's point about good learning, right? And effortful learning. It's a theme in the flow state, which is considered by many to be a form of optimal experience. So I completely agree. And that, I would argue, is also a counter to a hedonistic lifestyle, which, by the way, is not highly correlated with life satisfaction. A eudaimonic lifestyle is, a hedonistic is not, which is an important distinguishment. But if you're only worried about pleasantness and you're unwilling to do the hard work to deconstruct your biases and think about the pain you've caused others, you're never going to grow, right? And if you're not growing, Scott Barry Kaufman would argue, you're not on a trajectory towards self-actualization, which I think he would say is really the ultimate aim of life.
We could talk. I think we almost did an hour and a half, but like, I feel like I could talk to you guys forever about this. I love.
You brought it back to education. I'm glad you brought it back to education. So we need to focus in on education more for these last few minutes, at least. Were you going to say something? Sorry, though.
No. I was just going to say, like, I could it's so nuanced. I love nuance. I love complexity. I love just like scratching my head, like, this is frustrating. I like that, because I think that means that, like you said, like, we're getting somewhere with this. But yeah, John, please share your thoughts on how this applies in the educational context.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start with storytelling, but in a slightly different tangent, in the sense that the importance of teaching students how to construct a good narrative of their lives is important in another respect in education for their metacognition. So research suggests that most people have bad metacognition, right? Metacognition being your awareness of your level of skills and knowledge and your kind of self-regulation skills to do something about that, to improve your learning methods and processes in response to where your level of knowledge and skills are. And all kinds of factors affect this. So someone with low self-esteem will, for example, downplay the level of knowledge and skills. Someone with a huge ego will often upplay them, and various psychological illusions play into this, such as the Dunning-Kruger effect, the tendency that's quite common to significantly overestimate one's competence in some area and underestimate one's lack of competence, right? And research suggests that most people have pretty poor metacognition, that it's not calibrated very well. And the studies on metacognition show that if you can really promote this amongst students, it can really enhance their learning and long-term potential. So that involves partly constructing a correct narrative of your life, of how you learn, of how skilled you are in some area, of how much you can improve your skills, of how much you know and so on, of the ways you learn, how you can do something about this. Now, that can be one part of a wider narrative, but all of the parts of your narrative relate to that. If your self-esteem impacts your ability to learn, then the narrative is not just, I know this much, it's what are the factors impacting how much I think I know about how much I know? Well, maybe it's my character, maybe it's my lack of confidence here. So an attendance to person's well-being as a whole can support metacognition as a whole, which can in turn support learning a great deal. And that relates to narrative.
Yeah. It's complex, but I think it's talking about it is something that can spark the interest in people to look further and then do some of that self-reflection. I think that's what you just need. You need that desire to want to learn about this stuff and to think about it, and to think about, if you want, like, do you want to be happy? Kids like, yeah. All right. Well, now you got to really think about it. What does that even mean? Let's define it. Let's break it down. It's not just going to be handed to you on a platter. It's you got to really think your way through this. And I think that research, even as flawed as it can be, is like a Jordan Peterson thing. It's like having a bad map is better than no map at all. Like having a target. You need some sort of target. So how do you do that? And so there are flaws to these maps, these social science studies. But what's the alternative? Just make things up as you go.
Yeah, randomity.
Right. Yeah,
right. 100% complete
Absolutely.
chaos. Yeah. I would add one more piece too to the education, because it just kind of occurred to me as we were talking about distress tolerance. And, John, I can't necessarily speak to what it's like in the UK, although I imagine it's quite similar. Will, like, we are often in the business of whether implicitly or explicitly sending the message that being wrong is a really, really bad thing, right? And they spend the better part of a decade and a half learning that lesson, and then develop into adults that probably have a pretty visceral fear of being wrong. Coming back to your comment about challenging yourself, getting into the weeds, distress tolerance, like, my entire worldview can get disrupted by this one perspective, this one study, this one book. That's a really, really uncomfortable feeling. I don't propose to have a solution, but I'm sort of raising the question if we're sort of a part of the problem as educators when we push that message.
I think kids are so failure averse. They're told that if you get an A-, then you'll never get into Harvard. You'll never get into Penn. And then it's like, then they'll have a breakdown when they don't get into Penn. I go, oh, why? I'm not going to get into Yale. Why? Did you want to study under Nick Kostakis? Like, is there a specific professor there or something? No. Why? What was your major? I don't know. Why are you so like? They're programmed to just like achieve. That William Dershowitz book, Excellent Sheep, I think is really good. Just like, and then they don't even know necessarily why. Yeah. Life application is so important in education. Like teaching kids, I teach history. Like teaching kids what the War of 1812, they don't give a shit. So, but if I explain it in a context of like, you just had a fight in the classroom, and now I'm sitting you guys right back next to each other. You're going to fight again, because the one who's lost to you is like, I shouldn't have lost to you. I'm stronger than you. I could beat you up. I was like, that's the War of 1812. You know what I mean? So like, I have to explain this stuff. Like, this is how you get your curfew extended. This is how you get a girl to notice you, whatever it is. Because without that, I think school is really, really difficult.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you guys for having this conversation with me, and Nick for reaching out to do this, because just one little post, and then we can just extrapolate, talk for an hour and a half. We could talk probably for like an 8-hour workday on this.
Yeah.
100%.
Let me share a couple of links in case you haven't already seen these in the channel. This conversation began with you asking, should we be aiming at happiness, and should education do that? So there is research that suggests that widespread pursuits of happiness contribute to increasing mental health problems amongst young people.
Especially when we define it more accurately, right?
So there's an article I've just shared with you from the Washington Post.
Our obsession with happiness is making our kids miserable.
Yeah, last year on that. And here's an academic article published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology in 2014 on how pursuing happiness, desperately seeking happiness, increases the risk of depression. Having happiness, I mean, again, this comes back to how...
Maybe it's self-absorbed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an element of it.
It comes back to how we define happiness in the first place. But there is research that suggests that if you're desperately pursuing happiness, or not even desperately, but that being your aim, that is contributing towards mental health problems, particularly among young people.
Yeah.
Depending on how you define it, right? If that's the
it would need to be looked at how it's being defined in those studies and so on. But I mean, it might be more things like what the generally taken definition of happiness is amongst young people. Because
I see, John, as a philosophy person, I see why this would appeal to you, because it is about pulling everything apart in a really deep way. It seems so aligned, like these studies and stuff seem so aligned with philosophy. Well, thanks guys for having this conversation with me. This is great. I'll put it out on my channels, and hopefully people will check in on your podcast, and I'll definitely check it out and listen to it.
Awesome, man. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. No, it was. I love these conversations. I really appreciate you guys and the work you're doing. Really cool.
Our pleasure. Same to you, and good luck with your school year and going part-time. I hope that goes well.
Take care, John. Great to meet you.
Hey, you too. Thank you. Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete, where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview, or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.